Welcome to UnityNow, the podcast where we discuss unity, stemming from the Unity 2020 plan, with one goal in mind: bring unity to America and end the Republican-Democrat duopoly. This podcast is created, produced, hosted, recorded, edited, and publicized by a wonderful team of Unity volunteers that came together from all over the country to collaborate in a remote environment. To provide a brief introduction of Unity, we offer this. Unity 2020 is a proposal put forward by Bret Weinstein, first announced on the Joe Rogan Experience in mid-June. From there, the movement was born, and since then, tens of thousands of volunteers have signed up, organized, and have begun to create a groundswell of support. The plan has always included a failsafe so that we would not be an election spoiler, that we would drop out of the 2020 election if it was determined that there's no viable path to the White House. And sadly, we did have to enforce that failsafe recently. However, we believe that unity continues to be the number one antidote for what ails the country right now, and so we're pressing on with a renewed spirit. To learn more and to become a volunteer, visit articlesofunity.org and check out Bret Weinstein's YouTube page and the Articles of Unity YouTube page for the weekly campfires. If you're listening via podcast, make sure to subscribe and rate and review us. That goes a long way in our popularity or searchability. And if you're checking us out on YouTube, whether it's a clip or the full episode, please make sure to subscribe, like, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff. Today's guest is Dr. Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer is the founding publisher of Skeptic magazine. He's the host of Science Salon podcast and a presidential fellow at Chapman University, where he teaches Skepticism 101. For 18 years, Michael was a monthly columnist for Scientific American. He's the author of the New York Times bestsellers Why People Believe Weird Things, The Believing Brain, Why Darwin Matters, The Science of Good and Evil, The Moral Arc, and Heavens on Earth. And I'll be surprised if his new book is not a bestseller, but his latest is Giving the Devil His Due, Reflections of a Scientific Humanist. I've actually had 4 previous conversations with Shermer on my podcast called The Social Exchange, and I know 2 things about him that made him an attractive interlocutor for this podcast. 1, he's a nice guy, easy to talk to. I know it's always going to be a good conversation. 2, he's a skeptic beyond all else. Meaning, when I told him about the Unity movement, he thought it was interesting. I could tell he thought about it in a positive light, and he was excited to talk about it. But he's never going to give something a pass just because he's fond of it or it sounds interesting. He's going to try to kick the tires, look under the hood, and try to figure out what's right about it, what's wrong about it, what's true or false, and he's going to do so using reliable methods of questioning and scientific rigor. I'm recording this intro post hoc, and I don't really know how much headway we were able to make. I mean, Shermer was able to say he thinks that the Unity principles are sound, that he has no idea how a movement like this could become competitive enough to truly contend with the duopoly to which we've become accustomed. And then again, he also recognizes his own biases. He might just not be open-minded enough or have had enough time to think about the Unity movement in order to offer deeper or maybe more optimistic insight. You can make what you want of Shermer's conclusions, but the conversation itself has to be useful. I mean, maybe the way that you listen to this, you feel validated and like we should move this whole proposal forward at warp speed. Or maybe you listen to him and it doesn't feel nice. You feel questioned or like you need to do introspection after listening to this. And I don't see that as a bad thing. Even if you disagree with him, I think that it's useful to hear what's on the mind of a well-known intellectual with no dog in the fight when he hears about our movement. In this way, it's got to be able to help us scale the way we need to scale the movement in order for it to be viable in the not-so-distant future. And I do need to make a correction before I take you to this podcast. I did my very best to give a 10,000-foot view of the Unity 2020 proposal in the heat of the moment, and what I meant to say to him is that the idea behind Unity is to alter the election process while still preserving and honoring the Constitution. And I think that's fair enough. I mean, that might be a clumsy way to describe this whole movement, but close enough for jazz. But that's not what I said. What I said instead was that the idea behind Unity 2020 is to, quote, sort of amend the Constitution while still preserving and honoring it. So, of course, the first thing out of Shermer's mouth, who can blame him, is, yeah, well, it's kind of tough to amend the Constitution. And so with that slip, I let the conversation happen for a little while, and you'll notice that the conversation does sort of course correct on its own. So I never interrupted or stopped the conversation to correct him. It worked out okay, even if it was a little clunky. We as a team decided not to edit anything from this conversation or any conversation if that edit might change its meaning. So just get ready. My confusing depiction, which happens briefly, of the Unity movement happens at the top of the interview, and it all works out fine. I just want whoever's listening to know for sure that the Unity 2020 proposal had nothing to do with amending the Constitution. The only thing we, as a group, want to amend, in the colloquial sense of the term, is the bizarre reality television-style process that we currently use to select presidential candidates. But I digress. No further preamble from me. Please enjoy my discussion with the Skeptic, Dr. Michael Shermer. Michael, thank you so much for being with me.
Oh, nice to see you.
So I want to talk to you about the Unity 2020 proposal that Brett Weinstein has put forward. And when I emailed you to ask you about it, first of all, I thought of you because I found out about it by way of just reporting. And I was interested in what was going on here and what the idea was. It sounded to me sort of like, a think tank, like maybe the Cato Institute's a think tank, or AEI is a think tank, and I thought, I wonder if this is different or why it is. And I learned that it's, a sort of progressive push to change the structure of politics, and I got really interested in it, and now I'm sort of immersed in it. And so I know that when I become immersed in something and think that it's great, that's when my critical thinking can tend to lead me astray. So I thought of you, and thinking that maybe if I introduced you to this movement and what it's all about, that you would have some insight about what you like about it, if you've seen anything like it before, and what difficulties you think that it might have now and into the future. So I'm going to get into all of that. Maybe you could just provide a little bit of background for people who don't know who you are or haven't read Skeptic magazine or any of your number of best-selling books.
Oh, okay. Well, my day job is publishing this magazine, Skeptic. It's the quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization devoted to, really analyzing and, where appropriate, debunking any and all claims of pretty much pseudoscience and science, the paranormal, the supernatural, any kind of fringe areas. Our specialty is kind of areas related to science that other scientists don't cover simply because they don't have the time or the background on what's going on with that particular claim. So, and we've been doing this for 27 years now. There's pretty much an endless supply of claims that we cover. More recently, we've been doing a lot on alternative medicine, anti-vaccination, conspiracy theories related to that, and other conspiracy theories like QAnon. And this kind of gives you an idea of what we're about. That is to say, we want to know what's true about anything anybody says. And of course, the best tools we have for that are science and reason, empiricism, rationality, and so forth, because we're not omniscient. No one's smart enough to, answer any particular question. So it's a community effort to try to debate, dispute, test claims that are made and see what's left standing. And what's left standing is not necessarily true with a capital T. In science, there's no such thing. It's that it has yet to be falsified, and therefore it still stands. So, commonly accepted theories like the theory of evolution or the Big Bang theory, whatever, are so well accepted that it's very unlikely they'll be overturned completely. There won't be a big paradigm shift again, like in that area. More likely they'll be fine-tuned. In the same way that Einstein didn't debunk or overturn Newton, he just, fine-tuned it, showed that, Newtonian mathematics breaks down at certain scales of the universe, that kind of thing. That's kind of mostly what happens. And then when we hit politically charged topics like vaccinations, for example, or climate change, they're highly polarized because those particular areas are affiliated with political policy. So allegedly Republicans are anti-science. Well, that's not true. They're pro-science in lots of areas. Just those are areas that are not connected to their politics or their religion. Right. So they worry about the theory of evolution because they think that contradicts their religious beliefs, or they worry about climate change because it's got affiliated with Al Gore in that film Inconvenient Truth, and therefore it's a liberal active area of science, and therefore we have to oppose it. But they're not anti-science in most areas. And the same thing on the left. The left tends to be, I think, anti-science when it comes to GMOs and nuclear power and a few other areas related to evolutionary psychology and, that kind of thing, human nature. And I think they're just as blind. But of course, they're not anti-science. It's just particular areas that push people's buttons. And so that's where we're especially careful in how we present ideas in Skeptic.
So when it comes to political persuasions, it sounds like you're saying that temperament has a lot to do with what you're willing to accept without deep analysis. If you're on the left, maybe you might be. I shouldn't start making these claims because I'm not. Psychometrics is not a forte. But maybe if you're on the left, you're a bit more compassionate. If you're on the right, you're a bit more conscientious, and so those temperamental preferences might allow you to either absorb or not a truth claim.
Oh, well, there is some of that. You're referring to the big 5 personality dimensions. Mm-hmm. Ocean, openness to experience, conscientiousness, OCEAN, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or sort of emotional capability, whatever. So, allegedly, conservatives are a little higher on conscientiousness, a little lower on openness to experience. Liberals are higher on openness to experience. They travel more. They have more books on travel in their homes, things like that. They're more open to ideas or cultures that are different from them. Conservatives, this is kind of why they're conservative. They want to conserve the status quo, which usually means not adopting, every new idea or cultural artifact that comes along. And, so there is some truth to that. But if you drill down to why people self-select into different parties, if you ask them, they'll give you a slew of arguments. Well, I'm a conservative because these are my positions on abortion, gun control, immigration, and so on, and they have the best arguments. And but that isn't really why. People gravitate toward these political positions at a fairly young age before they've really thought through the arguments. And it has more to do with who you like hanging out with, what worldviews you're comfortable in your skin being around and sort of being immersed in. And then the arguments come later. As a kind of a justification for the emotional preference. And, the fact is we need both liberals and conservatives, to kind of push the pendulum back and forth so neither side goes too far. So, politics is, of course, when we're recording this, it's a pretty volatile time. We'll see what happens in a few weeks. But I do think if we pull back and take a 30,000 feet view of the whole landscape, for centuries we've kind of been in this, the left and the right pushing back and forth. And I think that's just necessary for a robust civil society and democracy.
I'll talk more about the specifics of this sort of movement that I asked you on to discuss, but maybe you'll soften the blows here, because I think that I've been with a group of people who have felt like they're in crisis mode for the past few months. Do you think that we are in more of a debacle now than we have been in history, or do you think this is par for the course?
Yeah. Well, I'm old enough now to remember, that, sort of 1968 and then Nixon and the Vietnam War. Those were pretty crazy times, assassinations of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy and, the terrorist attacks, the black militants, the, kind of Marxist revolutionaries, Che Guevara, all that was, if you look at like the number of domestic terrorist attacks in the 70s, they were way higher than anything we are experiencing now. And, the protests of, burning inner cities and, Molotov cocktails and things like that, just as bad, if not worse, than anything we've seen in Seattle and Portland the last couple of months by Antifa, or on the opposite side of the scale, the Proud Boys and these right-wing militias, like these nut jobs that wanted to start a civil war by capturing the governor of Michigan. And, you look at the pictures of these guys and it's just like, how they could possibly ever think, like, we're like the founding fathers, like Jefferson and Payne and Franklin. And, these are just morons that are just knuckleheads. They have no idea what they're doing and how that actually works, and we now have a lot of research on how to achieve political change, violently or non-violently. And so Erica Chenoweth has the big database on this, and she's got several really good books, popular book and a couple of technical scholarly works on this with a huge database from all over the world. And the result is pretty clear that nonviolent change achieves the goals that you're after far more successfully than violence does. And she even drills down to figure out, well, why is that? And the answer is because to achieve a certain level of political change, you need a certain percentage of the population to be behind the movement. It doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to have half or even a third. But you do have to have enough regular folks, just working people, moms, teenagers, the local pastor, just kind of regular peoples, not firebrand revolutionaries. That's not going to do it. You need the people that have the reins of power to pull you along to help bring about the changes you're after. And the moment you start bombing things, they're out of there. And the moment you start killing people, the funding dries up. No one wants to fund a group that's going to do that sort of thing. Anyway, so that's I recommend people look at that. It's not that violence never achieves anything, but it's just far less likely to do so. In our own history, yes, we had a Revolutionary War. Yes, we had to fight a civil war to end slavery, and that cost over 500,000 lives. And yes, Eisenhower had to send in the federal troops to desegregate Alabama schools. And, sometimes you got to have guys with guns to make the change. But the guys with guns have to be legitimate authorities. That is to say, by Weber's definition of government is, an institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, so that people recognize that. And then you can also keep checks and balances on the people with the guns. And so that has to be done very carefully. But other than that, when people just pick up arms themselves, it rarely ends well. And it almost never achieves the goals you're after. And next to never does it create a whole new state. That's very rare, where we're going to have a war here and we're going to create our own nation. That almost never happens. And anyway, so that's my thoughts on that.
I'm in a weird place where I understand that when I look at social media and the news that makes it to my screen or to my doorstep, that I'm seeing things sort of narrowly. But, okay, take it for what it is. I see that people are in a hurry to burn everything down, and at the same time, people are aware that critical thinking is the way out of this and not violence. I see the former being acted out a lot. I don't see the critical thinking piece making its way to land so that policies are able to be discussed or that change is able to be made. Do you think I'm right there, or do you think my belief system is skewed?
Well, so first of all, yeah, you're in a bubble, but we're all in a bubble.
Yeah, right.
And, it's almost impossible to not be, and you emotionally gravitate toward groups that agree with your positions. Everybody does. I do that. And I'm now getting the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the LA Times, and it's kind of frustrating because that's just too much reading for one day, and to also have a life. But I try to at least skim the op-ed sections because I know they're not going to agree with each other. And sometimes I'll sit there and toggle back and forth between CNN and Fox, and it's just you can't believe they're even talking about the same planet. Or the same species or the same event. It's like, they're so radically different. And so I could see if you only watched Hannity and Fox News or whatever, of course you'd think Obama is the worst thing that ever happened to the species or something. Even Obama said, I wouldn't vote for myself if I only watched Fox News. But to be fair, CNN has gotten so bad I can't even watch it anymore. There's, endless panel discussions and people shouting over each other. So yeah, you got to find a bubble that not just agrees with you, but also disagrees with you in a way you can absorb it. It's not just so obnoxious you can't take it. I find that social media is a good way to search for that. So, I mostly follow people that post articles to topics I'm interested in, and articles that are both on the left and the right by people that are fairly thoughtful. I'm not a conservative, but I enjoy reading someone like George Will, who's a kind of an intellectual conservative who makes really good arguments. Or if I want to go a little younger and a little more emotional, Ben Shapiro or Dinesh D'Souza or some of these public intellectuals, Dennis Prager and his videos, those are fairly well thought out. They're presenting an idea with an open agenda. This is what we think is the best idea for this particular issue. Here it is. Here's our arguments. And I often counter them with my own videos or whatever, but at least there's some way to think about that. And who would you invite to a college campus to speak? I probably wouldn't invite Milo Yiannopoulos, even though he seems like a likable guy. But I get the sense he's just sort of a professional provocateur. I'm not getting a set of arguments that I think he actually believes. I have no idea.
He says so. I mean, he says that's what he is, so I'll take him at his word.
Yeah, right, exactly. But someone like a George Will, he makes, his books are so good. Or Charles Krauthammer, who died last year. His books are just so good. And he's just a dyed-in-the-wool, straight in the middle of the bell curve conservative. I'm not. But I can certainly hear his arguments and learn from them. That's the kind of dialogue I think is worth having. And you can find it. It's there. You just have to search a little bit.
Is it there among the intellectual milieu specifically? Or is it there for all people to capture if they want it?
Oh, it's there. It's, they're public intellectuals that write popular books and op-ed pieces. Charles Krauthammer was a weekly opinion editorial writer for the Washington Post for, 30, 40 years or something. So yeah, it's there. Anybody could read it. They're all highly readable pieces and essays. I happen to run into them, I suppose, because I traffic in the area of kind of intellectual history and ideas, I suppose. But still, anyway, all this online now, that knowledge is free and opinions are easy to get. And so, I guess it just depends on what you consume and how you use it. And, the concern of social media now, of critics of social media, is that they have too much power or too much influence. I'm not convinced of that. In fact, I went on a Twitter rant a few weeks ago with that Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, featuring Tristan Harris, who's in a kind of a self-flagellating mode, like he's J. Robert Oppenheimer that just invented the bomb and now he has blood in his hands. Yeah. Because he was involved in the creation of the like button on Facebook or whatever it was. It's like, dude, you're not that important. That's a little too self-important. And but even my opinions aside, the research, what little we have in the last few years since the 2016 election, I'll point your listeners to Hugo Mercier's new book, Not Born Yesterday, in which he documents what little research there is that shows that it probably didn't have that big of an effect on the election. And for this reason, most political advertising has little to no effect on voters' preferences. Really, he thinks it's a waste of money, and I think he's right. Really what it is signaling to your base, I'm your guy. So it's particularly important in primaries advertising, because most voters are going to vote for your party or the other party. We're so close to, 50-50 that swaying people to the other party is going to be next to impossible, very difficult to do. And ads and commercials and Facebook postings or whatever are probably not going to do it. So my favorite example of this is like the Pizzagate thing. This is a crazy conspiracy theory, that QAnon has picked up on, that there's this satanic pedophile ring in the Democratic Party that Trump is fighting against. And so that nut job took a gun to the pizzeria in Philadelphia there and shot the place up. Didn't hurt anybody, thank God. But let's say, Skeptic does an investigation of Pizzagate, and we present all the evidence that there is no such thing as a satanic pedophile cult infiltrating the government. It's a complete false conspiracy theory. And the believers go, oh, you're right. I no longer believe that. Are they going to then vote for Hillary back in 2016? No, they were never going to vote for Hillary. They didn't like Hillary. They already hated her anyway and thought she was crazy. And the conspiracy theory just kind of fit that narrative that they already had in their head. Taking away the conspiracy theory, they don't go, oh, in that case, I guess Hillary looks pretty good. No. So most people are not going to be swayed by that.
You've walked us into a deep concern of mine, and maybe you'll put my mind at ease at this one too. I don't know. But if it's the case that people feel that they can't talk their way into persuasion, they can't be persuasive that you should vote for my guy because we have the answers, then there is something about social media that does seem to create a swell of, you can create fear. You can be afraid even if you're a logical, thoughtful person who thinks, well, I'm a white male, I'm not racist, but then again, this anti-racist curriculum is ubiquitous. I do want to be part of my tribe. I certainly don't want to be look like an outcast or a racist person or a bad person. So it does seem like there are polarizing fear tactics that can make people fall into allegiance with those points of view, emotional as they are.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think that's possible, and certainly those guys in Michigan, that right-wing militia, they seem to have been energized. They haven't said it was Trump that energized them, but that kind of overreach by Democratic politicians of, face mask wearing and, the coming vaccine and all that social distancing stuff. They seem to be motivated by that, and that they were organized through social media. That appears to be the case. So, of course, if this translates into behavior that's violent, then of course that's a problem. But I don't think breaking up the social media giants like Facebook and Instagram. Well, Instagram I guess is owned by Facebook, Google, Apple, and so on. I think this is just a crazy idea. It's not like they're going to go away. We're just going to want to use the services. So it's even when Facebook, when there was that pushback against Facebook back in 2016 after it came clear that the Russian hackers were using their platform. I suppose it was like hundreds of thousands of people quit their Facebook, which turned out to be like 0.001% of Facebook. They couldn't care less. It was just like, oh my God, how big is this thing? It's huge. And so I don't think that idea is necessary. Again, the moment you go down the road of, well, they need to start censoring and editing and controlling their content. Oh boy. That's a tough one, because here's the analogy. The New York Times gets, probably 200-300 submissions a day for opinion editorials. They accept like 2. They have their normal regular columnists, and then they accept a couple new ones each day. So almost no one gets selected. So the people they do publish, they vet, they fact check, they're edited and so on. And so if somebody writes something about you and it libels you, and let's say it hurts your income, then you have a legal right to sue the New York Times. They should have checked on that. Yep. And they can be held accountable. But if somebody does this on Facebook, are you going to sue Facebook? Well, that's kind of the direction we're moving in. But it isn't like Facebook gets 200 submissions a day and they vet them. They get, 2 billion a minute or something postings. So how can they possibly control that? So, last week they took down, several hundred QAnon related sites. Okay, but, how do you do that, across the board with all bad ideas? And who decides what's a bad idea? To me, again, I think QAnon's crazy, and I'll debunk them every day of the week if I need to. But I don't like the idea of Facebook, we're going to take down every QAnon site. Well, what about sort of QAnon, or the conspiracy theory that's not quite QAnon, but it's some other conspiracy theory? And then
the ideas are infinite. Exactly what is the rule about which ideas you leave up, which ideas you take down. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, now the New York Times has been posting every couple of days, new insights from the Trump tax returns. Yeah. Of course, people on the right go, that's fake news. That's a fake conspiracy theory. All right, well, should Facebook take down any references to Trump's tax returns? And by the way, how did they get those tax returns? I've not seen anybody explain where they got them and how that's even legal. But I thought that would be an example on the other side of, if you're going to go down the road of Facebook censoring, people on the right are going to go, okay, take that down. That's a fake conspiracy theory. Then they got to decide, well, which are the real conspiracy theories, which are the fake ones?
And that kind of gets me into another thing that I'm worried about, which is we have chosen, or not really chosen. We are led by a couple of avatars. We've got let's just call them the Hillary Clinton DNC types, and the George Bush conservative types, and then there's like a third crime family, which is the Trump administration. And this is coming from me. I'm not saying that this is an accurate label or that this is a good description of what this movement is, but I'm not confident. I think I heard a quote earlier today that Hillary Clinton will always be more like George Bush than she will be like a janitor, say, or someone who's going to be voting for her.
Okay.
And Donald Trump right now, I can't see any sunshine where I'm confident he's going to be able to solve an existential problem for us. And so when it comes to being representative and solving problems, I'm curious and I'm pessimistic about politics now. Maybe that's because I'm young and I feel like I'm entitled to better politics for some reason. But what do you think? Do you think that democracy, the duopoly as it stands, is a reasonable way forward, or should it change, or what?
Well, in general, of course, I don't know, no one knows, but it's possible that we'll have a change of power and it'll be peaceful, and then come January, life will settle back down to normal, whoever's president, probably Biden. And maybe Trump will just go away. Maybe his followers won't surround the White House with guns and we'll have descend into chaos. Although I just had on my podcast Richard Kreitner with his new book, Break It Up, about the history of secession attempts and ideas and movements in the United States going back to, say, the 17th century. So long before the American Revolution, there were many attempts to kind of unify things and how next to impossible it was to get a country going in the first place. And then all the attempts since the Revolutionary War to break it up. And, here in California, there's a movement for California, Oregon, and Washington to break off. Cascadia would be the name of our new country. And we'd be the 5th largest country in the world, I guess. And then, of course, Texas, there's always been a Texas secessionist movement and so on. But it turns out there was a bunch I'd never even heard of that I had no idea. Now, most of these don't go anywhere because they can't get enough momentum. And you get too many crazies with, guns and violence on the side, so people reject it or whatever. But, I think probably things will just carry on and we'll be fine. There's a lot of ruin in a nation, as Adam Smith said, that it takes a lot to destroy a nation. Then again, the Soviet Union fell in a matter of a year, really just a few months, that no one saw. And so clearly it's and they were big and powerful and had a very strong government, at least so we thought from the outside. So it's possible. I mean, anything is possible, I guess. But again, Nixon, if you go back to Nixon and how crazy those times were and the Vietnam War and all that, and all the shenanigans that we were doing with, South American democracy supporting fascist dictatorships over communist dictatorships, because at least the fascists were more friendly toward American business and industrial interests than the communists were, and they were less likely to nationalize companies if we invested in them and so forth. And, it's like, wait, we were helping to rig elections? Yeah, we sure were. CIA was involved in a lot of that, all the way through Reagan with the Iran-Contra. See, these are real conspiracy theories, right? I mean, these are conspiracy theories that turn out to be true.
Right.
They're not as sexy as global domination or Bill Gates is going to take over the world. Not like that, but more the kind of very predictable in politics or in business, like Volkswagen inspiring to cheat the emission standards in Europe. That's a conspiracy, right? That doesn't get as much play as the aliens are being hid in Area 51 or whatever, or 9/11 was an inside job. More concerning is the building of the homeland security and the violation of our rights of privacy that came after 9/11. So in a way, to me, the 9/11 truthers are distracting people from the real conspiracy, just that Snowden has, called attention to. That all this stuff, warrantless searches and all these kinds of things, like, wait, we were doing this? You mean Bush? Not just Bush, Obama too. Oh. Mm-hmm. Wait, what?
I mean, totally signing on the dotted line for. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so that, that kind of thing concerns me. But the solution, more checks and balances, the better, So I'd never heard of this Unity 2020 until you mentioned it. Mm-hmm. As I understand it, I guess if you have more people from both sides that are keeping anyone from getting too much power, that's good. Yeah. I mean, that was the original intent when the founders set up the system we have. You have this tripartite government, and the whole point of that is to make sure no one gets too much power.
I'm going to throw a couple things out there, and then you can feel free to hook it back. Yeah, I think when I first started studying this movement, I'm interested in Brett anyway. I was interested in him when the Evergreen debacle happened, and then since then as just an evolutionary biologist. And I talked to a guy that's running the campaign, managing the campaign. His name's Alexander Gold. He's an actor. He was the guy who played Finding Nemo when he was younger.
Okay.
And so anyway, that doesn't really matter. It's just for reference. He started convincing me about what this was about and why it was useful, why this movement was useful. Kind of the idea that it's possible that something like the extremes of the left or the extremes of the right could scale. Maybe they won't, but they could. And if they do, that's such a risk, and we don't really have the capacity to solve those problems or talk through them or work through them. And then on top of that, we have our existing problems that are bubbling up. We have now a global pandemic to worry about, but we also have, student debt to worry about, or hopelessness and isolation, if that's something that can actually be measured, maybe. But I don't put too much weight into that. So Brett's idea is, okay, how can you sort of amend the Constitution in a way that preserves it and honors its tenets, but also shifts things so that they're 21st century compatible? And his idea is, well, what if you run somebody on the center right and you run somebody on the center left, and they're a presidential, vice presidential ticket respectively, and then they join forces, they govern jointly, and whoever's president, they'll shift roles the next election, assuming that they win. They appoint their cabinet thusly, and hopefully the idea is, okay, critical thinking happens. People are aware of their biases enough that they're going to lean on somebody else from a different persuasion to be able to help them make decisions. And so that was his sort of his crisis move for 2020. He added a failsafe that we don't want to be this sort of libertarian or Green Party spoiler. So if it obviously can't scale enough to be winnable, we won't even be on the ballot. And so the movement isn't on the ballot. But I think that's something that he's very interested in pursuing moving forward.
Yeah.
That's a 30,000-foot view of the whole thing, but interested to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I see where you're going with that. Well, I mean, of course, I like the idea because, you get, again, more pushback against any one person. I was going to read you one of my favorite quotes from the Founding Fathers here. Let's see. From the Federalist Papers. It had to do with what you got to do to structure a government so that you govern the people, but then the government has to govern itself. And that's the, kind of the tricky part.
That you said it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I don't have it right here in front of me. It's Madison's Federalist Paper number 51. And it references human nature. That human nature is such that you need those checks and balances because whoever has power is not going to want to give it up. So I like that idea, and of course, there's lots of ideas like that that political scientists come up with. Implementing them is the hard part.
Right.
You've seen just. This what Brett's describing would require an amendment to the Constitution, and therefore you need 2/3 of the states. Very difficult to get. And so forth. And you've seen how difficult it is, even with something relatively simple like the Electoral College, say by comparison, and how next to impossible it is to even get a conversation going about changing that. Or more recently, bringing in 2 more states, Puerto Rico and what's the District of Columbia, make them an actual state where they'd have 2 senators. Yeah. And of course, whoever thinks that they're going to more likely lose an election if you introduce that, they're going to be against it just automatically. So the Republicans are going to be against adding states because that's going to add senators and representatives that are more likely to be Democratic and so forth. I don't know. If there's one thing I'm discouraged about, it's how difficult it is to make change of any kind of substantive level of the Constitution, just because, not because people are irrational, it's just because people are so tribal. Mm-hmm. And, even something, like abortion, oh boy, it's still controversial, after 1973, Roe v. Wade. It's a long time ago, but it's like as if it was yesterday. It still is a national conversation. So, and it's still Republicans are trying to pack the court. They're accusing Biden of want to pack the court. It's like, this is what you guys have been doing. Both sides want to do that.
Everyone would love to pack the court. Yeah, right.
Yeah, everybody. Just be honest about it. So anything that would keep that sort of thing from happening is good. That is, no one gets too much power on either side. So I like that. Brett's an interesting guy. He's smart. I remember when he started talking about was it Plan B or Game B or something like that on Joe Rogan? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and it's like, well, okay, what is this? This sounds super interesting. What is this? And but he just could not kind of get it out. And Joe kept pushing him, come on, dude, give us an example. What would you do about this or that? Well, this, I don't know. And it's like, okay, well, maybe write it down, publish it.
I think this is it. I think this is I think this is a manifestation of that sort of line of philosophy, let's call it. It's one of those things that you don't know if something works in theory because things that are only theoretical don't work or not work. They just are theories. But in terms of philosophy and politics, so it's more constructive than I think that Joe Rogan talked, because he was trying to say, how do you follow the rules that we've adopted, that we sort of need to follow, the things that are worth democratizing, the ways of life that we're accustomed to living, but follow the rules in a slightly different way, to continue to be creative and open-minded enough to structure things so that they meet the current challenges. I have a sense that most people kind of want to do that if they could be convinced that this could be done in earnest.
Yeah, I wrote an article in my latest book called Governing Mars about, okay, we're going to go to Mars. Okay, what kind of government are we going to set up? Now, if you have, 8 people or 10 people, 12 people, whatever, just astronauts working for NASA or for SpaceX, that's not too complicated. But, what if it's a permanent colony and then there's, instead of 20, there's 20,000 people or 200,000 people or 2 million or 20 million, 200 million. All of a sudden you have a nation state or whatever, what kind of government? And, I would love to see something like, I don't know if it's Brett's solution, but just try some new experiments.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the experiment we have going here, it's almost 250 years now, but that kind of momentum is very difficult to change now. And the structures are so built into the system that it's almost like you need a clean start, which is, of course, what the founders had when they came here, a clean start. Okay. And they came up with, pretty good solutions. And these guys were super smart, but they're not gods. I have some doubts about the Second Amendment and guns because of the problem that's generated there. And the Electoral College, it seems like that could be changed. And a few other things. But so let's just have a clean start in Mars and start over there. And I would like to see maybe even, like 10 different experiments on Mars, 10 different kind of government structures, and see which one works. Now, science fiction authors have played this out. Kim Stanley Robinson, I think is his name, has that Mars trilogy where he has different government structures, something like that. So those are kind of thought experiments that are good, and maybe Brett's good at thought experiments. But again, actually putting it into practice, boots on the ground, so to speak, that's really hard to do. And people have tried to do these things over the decades, or, third-party candidates, and, as you said, well, we don't want to be a spoiler because we know what happens. So, right. Yeah, okay, but then how does a third party get a toehold? If they're just going to take 2 or 3% of the vote, which is all you need to spoil an election, but that's not enough for them to do anything. If you're still a minor party, you still need maybe 10 to 20% for the winning party to say, okay, well, we need you and your supporters in, so we're going to change some of our platform to adopt your ideas. This is what the losing party tries to do, is to get at least some of their points in there. But how do you do that without completely spoiling the election? I don't know.
That I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, European nations have multiple parties. Like Germany has many parties, but it's structured rather differently than ours. Ours is a duopoly, and it seems really difficult to change the way the money is flows one direction or the other, and just the gerrymandering, and it's just beyond me how to actually make the change. It's fun to talk about these things, on podcasts or on Twitter or whatever, but but actually doing something, I don't know, that's hard, really hard.
Yeah, it's tough. That's why I think that I completely commend Brett and everyone who's been working with him to try to put this into something that's practical and real. I think there's some subset of the population who at least believes that, in line with what you said about starting over. Okay, what if we could just start anew and start something? Okay, you have to burn it all to the ground first, or something like that. I say burn it all to the ground.
Yeah,
maybe it's because I've been watching too much CNN. But, and it says, I think Brett's brother, Eric, this is his statement. Well, nice, you want to burn it to the ground. Have you thought about doing the courtesy act of fixing things first? I think that probably most people don't want to be part of the rubble that would be taken down to be able to start anew. Do you reject those two choices?
Yeah. Of course, the Yeah, the burning it all down to start over it never works, as I mentioned earlier.
Sure.
In other words, violent political change almost never works.
Yeah.
Because again, you can't get enough support. Most people are just not going to sign on to that, even if they accept most of the points of your planks in your platform. But again, it's just too much. Breaking Starbucks windows is just not the way to go for political change. Or on the other side, capturing the Michigan governor and holding her captive to get your political change. It's not going to work. It'll never work. So how to start over when the earth is pretty much all full up and every place is taken. And really, even the UN, they're not keen on countries changing borders. So like when Russia annexed the Crimea, that was a pretty big deal. But that kind of thing used to happen. Before World War II, that used to happen all the time. If you look at political border maps pre-World War II, you just go back every decade and the borders are moving around all over the place. But now, written into international law is you just don't do that. The borders are pretty much permanent now. And so even changing something like that would be very difficult legally. And, war is illegal. This is why you have to get the UN to sign off on some military action. Well, you don't have to, but you're supposed to. And so, anyway, but in general, I think that's good because because usually when borders are changing, historically, people die. This is usually done violently. That's not good. How to do it peacefully, again, illegally, it's a long nightmare. Even just like I wrote about the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. So, that took, like a century of activism. Just things are speeding up. The civil rights movement happened a little faster than women's right to vote. And the gay rights, same-sex marriage thing happened even faster. But even that, so we're going back, say, 1970s, stonewalled through and just put a pin at 2015 when the U.S. Supreme Court voted to make same-sex marriage the law of the land. End of story. But even that, we're talking about almost 50 years of activism, say from the 50s to 2015, something like that, 60s. So that it happens very slowly.
Does it worry you that something like the Soviet Union and how that dissipated fairly quickly from a historical perspective, it seems like that can happen faster than something can be changed for the better?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that could happen. Although apparently there was a lot going on behind the scenes that we did not know about, economically especially, that was causing, societal breakdown that probably would not happen here. And also we have enough checks and balances in our democracy to prevent a total, savagery and breakdown. Not impossible, though. It has happened elsewhere. And again, Richard Kreitner's book, Break It Up, after I read that, I thought, woo, boy, I guess this really could happen. This just seems impossible, but you never know. Yeah.
So when it comes to, you seem like you're in favor of trying to maintain and preserve the stability of the structures that we have in place now, rather than doing something too forwardly to try to shake things up. Do I have the right beam on that, or maybe?
Well,
no?
So the balance here is between. Again, here I'll just give you my notes. Tomorrow night I'm debating Dinesh D'Souza on something like this.
Wow.
This question of what's better for human flourishing, religious conservative values or secular liberal values. And at the French Assembly of 1789, on the eve of revolution calling for change, the delegates who favored conserving the status quo sat on the right side of the chamber, while those who favored change sat on the left. So the terms right and left have stood for conservatism and liberalism ever since. And they're always wrestling with this question: should we preserve the present order or should we change the present order? And so John Stuart Mill, then I quote him saying, a party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of a political life. So the original intellectual conservative, was Edmund Burke, who wrote a book on the French Revolution. He supported the American Revolution, but he was against the French Revolution. And the reason was because the French Revolution, they wanted to dismantle all social institutions, government, economic, religion, family, everything. And Burke's argument was that's too much.
Right.
This kind of balance between conserving the status quo and instituting change. And all societies kind of go through that balance. And conservatives, in general, on average, want to conserve social institutions for stability purposes, and liberals want to change them so that more people have more rights and have, more access to the benefits of a civil society and so forth. So things like democracy, the rule of law, free trade and capitalism, the civilizing process of good manners and self-control, and social institutions like marriage, family, religions, and charitable organizations that teach morals and encourage us to do the right thing. This is what Burke was saying, that the American Revolution sustained all those things that are good and then made the changes that were necessary that were bad, that is taxation without representation and so forth. But clearly Burke went too far. I mean, it would be unreasonable to argue that moral crusaders should never have called for the abolition of witch hunts, torture, and slavery just because these were long-standing traditions, or that the divine right of kings is the best government there is, therefore we should retain that. No. That most of the moral progress that's happened over the centuries has been from liberal, especially secular liberal reformers, for civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, children's rights, animal rights, safety and workers' rights, social welfare for the elderly, poor, sick, and children, protection of the environment, anti-discrimination laws, and so forth. So here I side on the kind of the liberal end of things, that most of those good things come about from secular liberal movements for change. Now, of course, the problem is those go too far, as we've seen recently with Antifa and Black Lives Matter and, the violent revolution or, violent protests. Peaceful protests can be very effective. And it's good that oppressed minorities voice their opposition to the oppression. That's good. That's how it happens. With gay rights, women's rights, civil rights, and so on. But again, the moment you start breaking Starbucks windows, you're going to lose the momentum from the public.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
I'm kind of rambling on here, but the bigger picture is that Burke outlined, and again, he was a conservative. I'm not, but you can't just burn it all down. No one is smart enough to create a brand new society from scratch, or there's no committee of social engineers that are going to design a perfect society. We've had 10,000 years of experimentation. Let's take what's worked and use that and jettison the stuff that doesn't work. What do you mean by work? I mean the sort of flourishing of more people, kind of a utilitarian argument, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and that people, it's a natural human right to want to live long, healthy lives, to be, happy, rich, successful, healthy, and so forth. And that, whatever leads to that, so certain institutions that we've tried are better for that, and others are not so good for that. So the rub is how to get rid of the bad ones.
Conservatives will continue to preserve things until they turn into dead wood and float away, and progressives if they're not careful, will run away and go far too far. Yeah, so, again, the Constitution has built into it this kind of stability where if you want to make a big change, you need more than 51%. You need 2/3. That's the whole purpose of that, just so that we're not willy-nilly just changing things because the mob, this is what's called tyranny of the majority. I think it was Monroe or Madison. I think it was Monroe that coined that expression, tyranny of the majority, which is a pure democracy is not good. We don't have a pure democracy, right? We have a representative democracy or a constitutional republic, because you don't want the mob deciding these things, right? You get 51% of the people that, say, hang all the Jews. Right.
Okay. No. We don't want that, right? So
the angry mob, by definition, is not thinking critically, right? I mean, like you said, peaceful protesting is, we've thought about this long enough and this is affecting us enough that we need to be out keeping people aware, but advocacy brings with it a lack, perhaps, of willingness to change one's perspective.
I think that, moral suasion, that is, making rational arguments, is ultimately the right way to go.
Yeah.
Now, that's not always enough. Sometimes, again, you need the federal troops to go in to desegregate the schools or whatever, because the racist governor is saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. We don't want those blacks in our schools, and then the federal government says, well, too bad. because we're coming down there and you are going to do this. Sometimes that's what it takes, until the old guys die out and the new generation comes of age thinking differently, So again, as I like to say, conservatives today are more socially liberal than liberals were in, say, the 1950s. If you ask a conservative today, I'm going to ask this audience tomorrow night at this church with Dinesh D'Souza, how many of you are worried about interracial marriage? They're going to look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? Who cares? Of course they should be able to marry anybody you want. Right.
Yeah.
But 50 years ago, you would have been against this, totally against this. Right. And so if we just take same-sex marriage as the same kind of question, 10 years ago, most people, conservatives, would have been against it. Heck, even in 2011, Obama and Hillary both, at least publicly, said they opposed same-sex marriage. Maybe in their hearts they didn't believe that, but they thought they at least had to say that to get elected, say something like that. But in any case, my point is that once that change happens, then people get used to it. And then they stop thinking about it in discriminatory ways. Again, it wasn't that long ago that women couldn't vote just a century ago. Just think about that. America is a great democracy. Well, we weren't even a democracy in 1920 until women could vote, right? And then really not until the Civil Rights the Voting Rights Act in 1964, when Johnson signed that. That then really blacks could vote. Okay, so when do you want to start the clock for when America became a real democracy? 1964, and even now, we're seeing voter suppression attempts and things like that. So, oh boy, so we have ways to go on that.
Are you confident at all that we're not suffering a survivorship bias? That is, are there problems at scale that are tough enough and that will be consequential enough and are happening rapidly enough that our systems of being able to tackle those problems are not sufficient to solve?
Maybe.
So, if you look back at history and say, yeah, there have been big problems, and those have been sorted out by, we have a constitution, and it's done its job for the most part, and we're still fixing things.
Yeah.
Is it possible that that doesn't map on to current problems and the speed at which they become problems?
I don't think so. I think the system works pretty well. Again, the Trump phenomenon is out there. It is unusual. By comparison, someone like Bush or Romney seem like, conservative statesmen of great respect.
Sure.
By comparison.
I never thought I'd miss Bush.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's still baffling to me that we got Trump instead of, say, Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
Just because, the religious right is so effective at getting the vote out. And Ted Cruz is the real deal. He really believes this stuff and he lives it. Trump, not so much. He's, not really exactly the moral standards that evangelicals say that they believe in. Okay, so how did we, and Ted Cruz is a real politician. He's just not some fringe guy. Or Marco Rubio, how'd we end up with, I don't really know. People are going to be trying to sort that out for decades, I suppose. Even so, we didn't end up in a war with North Korea or with Putin. And so, of course, the response to that is, well, because he likes dictators. Well, okay, but we haven't been in a war with anybody. And, we were all complaining about too many troops in other countries and that the military, is too interventionistic. So Trump has been moving in the right direction for those of us concerned about that sort of thing. Okay, that's good. So in other words, the world didn't end, and it's entirely possible it could be chaos between November 3rd and January 20th. Who knows? Probably not. I think we're going to get through this as well. But maybe, I could be blindly optimistic, but who knows?
What's your biggest concern, if there is one?
Well, it would be that. It would be, my biggest concern would be, say, the economic chaos. The markets hate instability. So if, say, we don't have a clear winner by maybe a month after November 3rd, say the first week of December, I forget the date. What's the December 15th, the Electoral College has to meet? I forget the exact date. But if we don't have a clear winner by the time the Electoral College is supposed to meet and cast their votes, that could be really disruptive for the economy. Again, I don't think the Constitution is going to be tossed out and entire government is going to be restructured and we're going to end up with something radically different. That's not likely to happen. Much more likely is just total economic chaos, even worse than it's been because of the pandemic. That has me worried.
I think that I'll ask just a couple more questions, and I appreciate your time so far. There seems to be something about Trump where he's the first person to talk about issues that maybe no one else is talking about. Like, and I could be wrong here, but I haven't heard anybody really in the 2016 election, didn't really hear anybody talking about borders or immigration in a real way, you know, in a way that it's not just you can guess what the next few lines are going to be. And Trump had a pretty clear position. I think it was a stupid position on immigration, but he seemed to have a pretty clear one. So I think for all the people yearning for some sort of policy on that, he was able to answer that question. And that sort of was mixed with a theatrical performance. Trump reminds me of like an infomercial that you memorize, and it's sort of like the if it rhymes, it's true kind of kind of idea. And I'm concerned now that there are even more issues that should be talked about in some sort of clear way that aren't being discussed. I think that
like what?
Talking about racism. I think that talking about racism is one of them, and not just talking about racism, like that racism exists. I think we all know that it exists, but maybe something like I feel that I'm even worried to say right now to you that I read White Fragility, and I think that was it was. I believe that was such a nonsense book. It was sort of like what you said about Tristan Harris, like you need to repent your sins for just being born, or I do. I'm a white male, and that maybe that's an issue that Biden's not willing to touch.
Yeah,
I think that if you really asked him, having a cocktail with him, he'd tell me he thinks the same thing. Yeah. I don't know, but I would guess so. But I don't think he's able to say it. I think there are things that people aren't able to say. And I
this is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons that I think will emerge as why Trump won was he's willing to say things that a lot of people are thinking. And the fact of the matter is we've come a long ways since the bad old 1950 days of segregated gyms and locker rooms and drinking fountains and everything else. That's not the America we live in anymore, but at least a part of the left, call it the progressive left rather than traditional liberalism, is basically arguing we are as racist as we've ever been. And the one reason I hate that argument is because it kind of discounts everything the civil rights activists did in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Basically, you're saying Dr. King's work did nothing? Of course, when I say that to them, they go, oh, no, of course we've made progress. Right, we've made a lot of progress. Pollsters don't even ask anymore, would you move out if a black family moved into your neighborhood? I mean, people would look at you like, what the hell are you talking about? And of course not. So you don't even have to ask anymore, or interracial marriage or whatever. Right, so... that's the kind of progress we've made. I mean, again, we had a black president for 2 terms, and there's a lot of successful blacks in business and industry and lots of professions that used to be completely closed off as they were to Jews before the 1950s. Say, like, Harvard had a quota for the number of Jews that were allowed. We have to, again, let's remember how bad things used to be, how much progress we've made. So when Trump voices that opposition to that argument that we're, as racist as we've ever been, as clumsy as he is at doing it, when he says things like, well, there's fine people on both sides or whatever, and people go, oh my God, their heads explode. He's but there's a lot of conservatives that go, yes, that's right. And he is saying it. And I'm afraid
it's the closest to truth that they've heard.
Yeah, right. That's right. And also they're afraid to say that at work or amongst their friends or whatever, even though they believe it. So Trump gets a lot of support when he says what a lot of people are thinking. And so again, this kind of anti-racist white fragility movement, most whites are not racists like whites were in the 1950s and so forth. They're just not. And so when they hear these accusations, like you're a racist or institutional racism and so on, and they look in the mirror and go, no, I'm not. And I do not want to listen to that anymore. And here's this guy that's standing up for me. All right. So that's going to be one of several things I think that emerges is why Trump won. People like to hear that. I know lots of I have conservative friends, cycling buddies, whatever. And this is what they tell me all the time. Did you hear what Trump said? He stood up to those assholes who said, I'm a racist. I'm not a racist. And he said it. And they like that, right? So that, that's a problem when the far left goes too far in that front. So anyway.
I've got two more questions for you, and then anything else you might want to discuss. But one is, let's say, with the understanding that you have only heard about it recently, that the Unity 2020, or let's say 2024 or something now, movement scaled large enough that there are three parties and it's not completely clear which one will win. It's like just as neck and neck as this race is now. It seems like either could win with some sort of voting sway. Would you be interested in a movement like that, or do you think that you don't have to tip your hand too much here, or do you think you would vote for a more traditional party?
Here's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see four. Yeah. Right. So libertarians, conservatives, or maybe classical liberals and conservatives, and then Democrats, and then something like a Bernie party, a progressive party, that maybe have Bernie as stand-in for what that represents, or AOC, something like that. Now, it doesn't matter which one I like, but the idea is that four of them, nobody can get too much power or too much persuasive or money to kind of control things. Right. And that would be more like in Germany. So like Angela Merkel has been in power for almost 25 years, I guess now. But she's always having to make compromises because they have the Green Party and the Social Democrats and the Religious Party and so on. They have lots of different parties. No one has too much power, and whoever wins has to bring into the party, into the administration, people from these different parties that represent it to make it work. I think that's what you're talking about here, and I like that idea. And so nobody can take us in a direction that goes too far, too fast.
Right. The different means to the same end, but yeah, that's the idea: is that nobody really takes the reins or can be bought. It's sort of checks in place to make sure that people can't be runaway progressives or runaway conservatives.
Right. But
do you have a sense about?
The Green Party and the Libertarian Party, they never get more than like 1/10% of the votes. Nothing. So
right.
I really have no idea.
The idea behind it would have to be like, one of the major pieces of pushback that we get is, where's the charisma? Where are the memes that help me remember your platform or what you're saying? Where is how are you reaching more than just your echo chamber of people who agree that critical thinking is necessary? I mean, how are you reaching the guy who's working on the oil rig in Texas or something?
The Libertarians had that a little bit with Ron Paul. He had a pretty enthusiastic base, and Ralph Nader had a pretty big following with his Green Party. What was his party? I forget what he called it, but
Nader's Green Party.
Yeah. So but even that was like the best these other parties ever did. I think it was like 1% or something. It was just nothing. Yeah. And it's just there's just so much money in the duopoly we have. I just have no idea how to break that, and it's not what I do. So I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about this with watching that. I forget if it was Hulu or Netflix or HBO or whatever. About Mrs. America, about Shafley opposing the Equal Rights Amendment. But they kind of showed the behind the scenes of what it takes to get the ERA passed. Again, how do you get 2/3 of the states? You got to go to every state, all 50 of them. You got to go to every county, all 50 and every 50 of the states, however many counties there are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of counties, thousands, I guess. And you got to have all these grassroots movements, and then somebody has to keep track of like each of the leaders of each of the grassroots movements and every one of the counties and every one of the states. It's a bureaucratic nightmare to kind of coordinate them all to get the vote, to get that to that 2/3 level, and that is really, really hard to do. Again,
the entire country is a lot bigger than I think people understand it to be.
It's massive, and the kind of temperament it takes to actually do that. It's one thing for you and me and Brad or whatever to chit chat about it on a podcast, but actually getting out there, boots on the ground and making these things happen. I mean, you got to open an office somewhere, and then you got to have staff that you got to pay. So you got to get money to pay the staff to run the office in all 50 states, and on and on and on. the people that run for political office, my hat's off to them. I just couldn't do it. I mean, it just, the money, the money that you end up making as your paycheck is nothing compared to the amount of work you got to do just to get there.
Sure.
So obviously,
it's your life, right?
Yeah, but obviously they have other motives, in terms of what they want to do with their lives or whatever. But anyway, it's just baffling to me.
So we need an Elon Musk of politics.
Yes, right.
And we need someone who's willing to do the equivalent of SpaceX for a presidential run.
But there's no payoff at the end where you end up with
there's no $1 billion
initial public offering, and all of a sudden you're a gazillionaire. That doesn't happen in that world. So maybe this is why we end up with the kind of mediocre politicians that where's the brightest, smartest, most talented people we have? They're in business or in academia or somewhere where they can actually do something. I don't know. Well, where's the Jeffersons
They're
and
bright
Paynes
enough
and
to
Franklin
know that they can take care. Yeah.
all the geniuses that the so-called founding fathers. Where are they now? Well, they're they're running companies, or they're doing other things. They're in entertainment or something. Who knows?
So we have plenty of enthusiastic people, plenty of very bright people, but maybe not everyone who has the altogether package to be able to spearhead something.
I mean, even this, 2020, we got Trump and Joe Biden. I mean, really, this is the best we got. 340 million Americans, and these are the two best we got. Oh boy. I like smart people, right? I mean, Obama, he's smart. Clinton was pretty smart. Kennedy, very smart. So that I like those kind of politicians. There is some research on this that more intelligent politicians are less likely to get us into wars and sort of take us down paths that are not too healthy for the country.
More intelligent, as in.
Well,
higher
just
IQ,
higher IQ, higher IQ, right? More well-read. If you look at the recent stuff that's come out about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how Kennedy and Khrushchev kind of navigated that's a really tricky, very complex, kind of abstract reasoning in a meta way. Like, so if I do this, then it's like a chess move. Then he's going to do, what's Khrushchev going to think if we do that? And it's like you got to think 12 moves ahead. That takes somebody who's pretty smart. Kennedy was very smart. I think that's safer. We're less likely to get ourselves in a nuclear war or some crazy military engagement.
So is it a fair reflection now that I've sort of explained the basics of this movement to you and you've responded? I've heard you say the same thing as what other smart, critically thinking-oriented people have said, which is that the principles sound great. If you can get to an end where people who are in power have to rely on other persuasions or other good ideas or, not just their emotional conclusions, but the problem might be in actually creating the thing.
Yeah.
It's not like people haven't tried, but how do you get it off the ground? Yeah,
you got to move beyond Twitter and podcasts. You got to write some op-ed pieces and get them published in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, somewhere big that reaches a lot of, not just a lot of people, but a lot of influential people. The people that read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, those are the movers and shakers. And then you got to write a book. Yeah. I mean, a really well-written, articulated, outlined argument for your case. There are people that do this, like Harvard professors in political science write books, about how to change the system. That's at least a start, because then people can read carefully and think about carefully what it is you're arguing. Anyway, that's my recommendation, but maybe that's because I'm a baby boomer and I still like print media, and maybe I'm behind the times. Although I'm on social media, I have a podcast, I'm trying to stay up with it all. But I'm kind of old school, I think you write a book. Put your theory in a book and at least start there. And from there, maybe you can build a movement. It's not impossible, but it's difficult.
All right. Do you have an idea, a guess about who will win this election?
I think Biden will probably win. I do. And I think that things will kind of settle back down and things will be more stable under Joe. I mean, I'm not overwhelmed with him at all. Nobody seems to be. He's pretty mediocre and average. I think it was David Frum that said, the traditional Republican supporter, Joe Biden, he'll do. That's his campaign slogan. He'll do.
Yeah, right.
Okay. That's probably right. To me, politician, I mainly want him to just leave me alone. Just do your job. Just keep the economy stable, the political system stable, the legal system stable. Just don't do anything too radical, right? Because, that's what's disruptive to normal lives. Us little people, we just want to live our lives and, don't take the country down some crazy pathway that's going to disrupt all of our lives.
Well, good luck tomorrow with Dinesh. I had no idea that you were doing that debate tomorrow, so thank you again for doing this.
Well, it was kind of a last-minute thing. I've debated Dinesh a number of times, and this kind of just came up at the last minute. And this will be the first time I've been on a plane in 11 months.
Oh, wow.
So,
tell me where again?
Yeah. I'm going to Detroit, to this church in Detroit.
Right, that's right.
So I'm getting push notices from the airlines. Don't forget your mask.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, you probably, that's...
Apparently, I got to wear the mask all day. Oh, boy.
Well, good luck with that. And you have a new book coming out, and it's
about...
No.
So my latest book is Giving the Devil His Due. It's a collection of essays, Cambridge University Press. The central theme is defending free speech and free thought, and I'm a kind of a purist in that regard. But I also have essays on, again, governing Mars and why there's something rather than nothing. It's sort of my kind of typical science and religion type related essays.
And when people look up Skeptic magazine, is that a sufficient way to find you in a lot?
Yeah, just go skeptic.com. That's it. And again, we're tackling a pretty sensitive issue here, race. Our cover story, our author, his argument is that race is just a completely loaded and misguided term. Populations, yes, there are population differences in IQ or sports or whatever. People, Americans are obsessed with racial differences of all kinds. But race is too big a category. So, well, blacks are good at basketball. Which blacks? Track and field, which black? You can't just say black. It's a meaningless term. The Haitian blacks or West African blacks or blacks from Kenya. Again, populations, is this more scientific way to think about these things. And populations are not, the word is not loaded with politics and history and an ugly history that the word race is. So I think the sooner we jettison and quit talking about race, to me, again, Dr. King's dream of, judging people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. We've gone the wrong direction.
Yeah, you want a race not to be so interesting.
Yes, now this is all anybody wants to talk about. It's like, this is the least interesting thing to me. How much melanin you have in your skin is unimportant.
Yeah, well, we'll get that book published one way or another, and when we do, we'll send it your way so you can so you can take it apart on
good.
Skeptic.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. Appreciate it.
All right, Zach. You're welcome.
Take care. Before I sign off, I just want to say thank you one more time to Dr. Michael Shermer for talking to us today. And thank you for tuning in. For more conversations and content like this, be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you prefer: Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. If you prefer to consume your podcast in video format, then you'll find full episodes and clips on YouTube. Follow the UnityNow podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram by clicking any of the links in the show notes. And be sure to sign up and get involved at articlesofunity.org.